Kia ora koutou. Have I got this at the right kind of... Yes, everyone can hear me? Thank you, fellow panellists. I found that fascinating, and there was so many areas of overlap, I think, between literally the places we've worked to our experiences of life. I have an affection for the building code as well. I think it's a very important piece of legislation that keeps us all safe, but we'll get to that later. So I'll sort of race through a couple of things that Petra has asked us to talk about. So my career journey, what attracted me to the public sector. So what I would say was when I was a student here at Otago University in the 90s, I didn't spend a lot of time thinking about what I would do once I'd finished studying. So I came to Otago, I was born in Dunedin. When I was a kid here, my dad said, "You're going to come here to study when you grow up." I was like, okay, I don't know what that means. But when it became time to choose where to study at the age of 18, I was living in Auckland, I came to Otago. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I'd thought about doing medicine because I loved chemistry. My friend told me that being a doctor would be boring. Why didn't I do law? And I said law would be boring. She said you could do an arts degree to fall back on. So that was kind of the extent to which there was any planning in the subjects that I took. So I applaud all of you for coming here to this evening and being curious about your professional future. I'm sure you all took far more care and were far more thoughtful in the way you chose your subjects than I did. But as I will return to in what I'm talking about tonight, and I think this sort of is something that you see across all of the panellists, is that you just take the next step and the next thing that interests you. And what I would say sort of that I've observed across my life and across my career is that it's way more interesting than I ever thought it would be. And I love what I do as a job. I never thought that would be possible. So I'll talk to you a bit about how I got to where I am. It's not impossible to do a job that you love and that plays to all of your strengths. So when I was at university, I didn't really know what jobs were. Like, I didn't know what you did. I knew what a teacher did. My mum was a teacher. I knew what police officers were. I knew there were people called lawyers, but I didn't really know what they were doing on a day-to-day basis. So I really didn't go to university as an 18-year-old with a clear sense of what my future looked like. And I would say that now I'm a middle-aged woman, I don't have a clear sense about what my future looks like. Some people might tell you you need to have a 5-year plan. I've been told that before. I reject that. I've never had a 5-year plan, and I think if the last few years in government have taught me anything, just don't have a plan, because you just do not know what the next day is going to look like. I could go back to work on Monday and find out there's a restructure. Who knows? So I think one of the skills that we all need to really develop and kind of maintain at the moment is a fleet-footedness, curiosity, resilience. There's going to be so many things that happen in your lives, in my life, where unfair things happen. The best person doesn't get the job. People take credit for what you do. How are you going to cope with those things when they happen to you in your life? Okay, just a few things to think about. So, as I said, studied at Otago. I generally chose subjects I was really interested in. I loved history. I really enjoyed the history honours year I did, and when I look back on my university career, I think that 4th year where we had to write a dissertation and did a whole lot of classes where we led discussion, that was the most important in terms of me developing the skills that I use on a day-to-day basis, and I'll talk about that a little later. When I finished university, I was completely sick of New Zealand. I'd been at university for 6 years, was over it. There were no jobs. I don't know if Ruth Richardson is a name that anybody in the room is aware of. It was a very hard time to be looking for a job, and it just didn't feel like a good country to be in. So I left almost immediately after finishing my studies and went to Japan and taught English for 2 years, which was the ideal thing for me to do at that time. I travelled, I lived in London for about 9 months, ran out of money, and then I was like, damn it, I have to come back to New Zealand and I need to look for a job. I came back, and 23-year-old myself said something like, I don't care what I do, but I am not going to live in Auckland, I am not going to work at Russell McVeigh, and I am not going to be a commercial lawyer. So I ended up doing all 3 of those things, and my lesson there is, like, don't be too certain about the kind of situations you might find yourself in. Law wasn't for me. But I did it for 8 years, and it taught me a lot of things that I use on a day-to-day basis. I value my time and other people's time very highly. When you're a lawyer, you are charging people in a 6-minute billable unit, so you make sure that the contribution you make is meaningful and worth that amount of time or resource. I made really good friends with the people I met at Russell McVeigh and other law firms I worked in, and I'm now very comfortable working with lawyers, which is a big part of my job at Oranga Tamariki. However, law didn't play to my strengths, and it was not necessarily always in line with my values, and I had a turning point in my 30s, my mid-30s, where I just knew I couldn't be a lawyer anymore. I was just like, I cannot do this any longer. And so I did what I always do when I am confused and don't know what to do next. I consulted my friends. So I referred earlier to the great people I met at Russell McVeigh. I met amazing people at university as well, and I think my degree was a really important thing that I got from Otago, but the friendships that I made when I was in my late teens, early 20s have endured, and they are one of the most important things in my life and one of the most important things that I gained from studying at Otago. So I had this turning point. One of my friends said, why don't you be a policy person? And I was like, I don't know what policy is. And then I looked at a few jobs and they said you needed a policy qualification. I thought, I don't have a policy qualification. I studied law and history. How could I be a policy advisor? And so my friend who'd worked in government as a lawyer told me that policy is a writing and thinking job, and that having worked as a lawyer with a history degree, I would be able to do that role. I went to Wellington. I spoke to several public servants about what they did. Sounded interesting. I spoke to a couple of recruiters, and one of them told me I would struggle to find a role as I didn't have any policy experience. But she put me forward for a role and said, oh, you know, I'll put you forward for this, they want to interview you. I got the first job I applied for, and this was working as a senior policy advisor on the review of the Foreshore and Seabed Act in 2008. And the reason I got that job was because the recruiting manager liked the fact that I had a law degree, I had been a lawyer, and I had a degree largely in New Zealand history. So when I was doing a degree in New Zealand history, a lot of people will be like, oh, New Zealand doesn't have a history. What are you studying? What's the big deal? And I did it because I loved it. Funnily enough, Jane talking about the Waitangi Tribunal, I wrote my history dissertation on the Waitangi Tribunal and the settlement of Māori fisheries claims. It had a longer title than that. But I was so interested in the Waitangi Tribunal, and I thought maybe I'd end up working there as well. But little did I know, 15 years after I graduated from university, somebody in Wellington would see that experience as something that she really, really valued. So since starting at Justice, as what was referred to earlier, I've worked across several agencies in various roles, but I thought it might be quite useful at this juncture to tell you what policy is, because it's kind of this, several people have referred to it, and I will talk to you about what it means in a central government context. I'm also talking tomorrow at 11 o'clock about how to apply for policy roles, 11 o'clock in this room, I think, and just there are several graduate policy schemes currently being advertised, so if any of this sounds interesting to you, come along tomorrow and I can talk to you a bit more about that. So the way I explain what policy in central government is, it's that it's an analytical process that supports good decision making. So this could be decision making by a minister, it's usually a minister in my world, cabinet, which is a group of ministers, a chief executive, or a cross-agency working group. So we follow a standard policy process where the first thing you do is you clearly define the problem. What's the problem you're trying to solve? And then you think about options to address that problem. You choose, you analyse those options against certain criteria, you choose the preferred option, and then you set out risks and mitigations associated with the option. Now that's a very, very high level description of what we do, but we follow a reasonably structured process to produce certain pieces of written work. So it's very normal for people in my team to draft a briefing to the minister. We might say to the minister, just think about something ridiculous. This isn't ridiculous, by the way. One of the things we're working on at the moment is amending the Oranga Tamariki Act to respond to the findings of the Royal Commission into Abuse and Care. So there's a piece of legislation currently before the House of Parliament. We brief the Minister with ideas on what could go into that legislation. We write her a briefing, she signs it, and we communicate through briefings. Briefings turn into cabinet papers where our Minister goes to cabinet and she persuades her fellow ministers to support her ideas, and then that becomes a piece of legislation. We do a lot of work working with stakeholders, similar to what Jane mentioned, working with people in the community. So we will consult with NGOs that provide support to young people, such as Barnados. We talk to the New Zealand Law Society. We talk to Voice Whakarongo Mai, which is a group of care experienced youth who we know will give us the insights that we're looking for into how our changes might affect people on the ground. Skills that humanities students build during their degree and that are essential for policy roles. Strong critical thinking and analysis skills, you all have these. If you do a degree for 3, 4, whatever years, you will have excellent written and verbal communication skills. These are things that you use every day in your job in policy and multiple other jobs. Curiosity. Comfort with ambiguity, the recognition that things are not black and white. I operate in a grey area, lots of different shades of grey, and you have to be comfortable with that. You probably don't even recognise you're really good at these things because one thing we know about people's strengths is that we often don't recognise them as strengths because they just seem normal to us. But what I'd encourage you to do when you're writing application letters or your CV is to sort of sit and reflect and think about, you know, how do the things that you have done and the things that you've been told by your lecturers or people have told you about you that reflect the job description. So are you a really great critical thinker? Do you have excellent analytical skills? And find ways to match those up to what the job description says. Couple of other just overarching lessons. Different people have different experiences. I'm telling you about mine. When I went to Wellington, as I said, I was told by a recruiter that I'd struggle to get a job because I didn't have the right experience. I got the first job I applied for. I was looking on LinkedIn earlier today and there was a guy from a recruitment company saying things like, he had views on how people should approach CV and cover letter writing, and he said that the cover letter wasn't as important as the CV. I completely disagree. If you're applying for a policy role or a role where those analytical skills, written skills are important, you absolutely need to do a killer cover letter. Do it yourself. Do not use AI to do it. It will be very obvious. If you're applying for a job in government, in a policy role, you must write a great cover letter. And you don't have to tick every box in the job description. You will probably see a long list of things that a recruitment manager says they want. That's kind of a wish list. If you can tick like 5 out of 8, apply for the job. Don't think you have to do everything and do it really well before you apply for it. Nearly finished. A couple of other quick things. I've asked some tips for students and graduates wanting to enter the sector. If you are interested in public service while you're studying, apply for intern programs over summer holidays. Employers like me really like to see that people have worked during their career, and I don't mean necessarily in an intern role or a professional role. If you can turn up to a cleaning job, I had a cleaning job my first 5 years at university. If you can do something like that and turn up every week or every day, I will know that you are work ready and that you have the discipline to come to work, and that when I ask you to do something that maybe you don't particularly want to do, you will do it. And so that is something that is definitely put your work opportunity, your work experience and any voluntary work you've done on your CV. It's really important. Wellington Outlook. It's been pretty bleak. The last year has been pretty bad, but it's definitely shifting. I think we're going through sort of, you know, we're coming out the bottom of the, what do you call that thing? The nadir. We're going up. I spoke to a recruiter yesterday and she said they're currently recruiting for 13 senior policy roles, which may not sound like very many, but it is a huge number. So there, as I said, there are 3 grad programs currently being advertised to Education, the Ministry for Regulation and the Ministry for Social Development. Grad programs are up and running, maybe not to the extent they have been in the past, but you can still apply for advisor roles even as a first job out of university. I interviewed several people who had finished university and were just looking for their first job earlier this year. The end.